So I am Joseph Barquin. I was a policy debater in the mid 2000s. I volunteer coach for Bravo now and Lambda in general. I'm mostly an LD coach at this point because uh, that's where I've been at. This will be a Decide lecture on the water resource topic. There are some things in here that I think will be very cool for you all. Some things that are very much review centric. So the table of contents, what's going to be covered in this lecture is just going over the basics of, again, what is a DISAD? How do we structure said DISAD? What does a 2AC say versus a DISAD, i.e. the tulip? The extensions and overview required to go for the DISAD in the block. And then finally, the disadvantages that you can have for the camp tournament. We can go a little bit in depth as to what other disadvantages you can probably run, but for this specific lecture, we're only going to go for the infrastructure and the economy because that's the one that's most pertaining to you all because that's in your evidence set. If at all, anytime you need me to slow down, tell me to slow down because I do sort of talk fast. It's from being a debater. I can't help it. It's been that way for years, and I've been criticized for it. So if you need me to slow down, please tell me to slow down. So what exactly is a DISAD? A DISAD is like another off-case position that we run in debate that states that if a plan happens, prevent something from occurring, that is probably good because it's going to prevent something bad from happening. I think the best analogy that I have from it is like the beach, right? We usually go to the beach because it's a great place to be. The water is calm, or if it's not calm, at least it's relaxing, it's cool, there's a sun out, and it's very beautiful, right? But if we have something like fracking and it's close to a beach site, it has unintended consequences, i.e. it could create an earthquake off of the coast of the beach. And depending on how big that earthquake is, it'll cause a tidal wave and disrupt the beach and everyone affected around it, right? Did the beach initially get wiped out because of the tidal wave? No. The tidal wave is a direct cause by fracking on an otherwise peaceful area, right? The one I use here is a train is traveling someplace to pick off and drop off people because it's an intended purpose. The affirmative plan does something, i.e. you decide to mess with the train signals. That'll delay the train and prevent it from operating or derailing it, i.e. impacts. Then people can't go to their jobs and stuff, right? But in policy debate, we generally don't like to go this micro, right? We like to go US and global because those are where the nice big impacts are, and that's where the resolution states that we should be in. So there is a specific structuring to a disadvantage, just like any off-case position. They follow generally this structure. There can be some amendments, i.e. the number of internal links, but generally speaking, these four things are the most necessary components: the uniqueness, the link, the internal link, and then the impact, or what we like to call a terminal impact, as to why the DISAD should be prioritized over the affirmative. So what is uniqueness? A uniqueness is just a description or like an event or the status of the status quo, or like what's just happening right now, right? Right now, I am giving a lecture. If the power were to go out because San Diego Gas and Electric had an unintended maintenance, that would be a disruption to the uniqueness, i.e. the next part, right? What is going on right now? We have a lot of purple backgrounds, Diego and myself. I think what's cool, right? There can be something that the plan does to change that purple background, i.e. leading to the DISAD chain. It's usually just like literally what's happening, right? Is the economy doing great? Is the economy doing bad? Is there traffic outside? Is there no traffic outside? Does the US want to pass certain plans? Does it not want to pass certain plans? How is our electricity grid? It's just like, what is happening, and do we care about it? Maybe, maybe not, but just what is happening, right? In this example, we use vaccines are widely available in the United States of America because it's true. It is current to the status quo. The Milwaukee Bucks are arguably the best team in the NBA currently because they just won a championship. Are they probably on paper? No, but they won, right? Barring injuries. I believe that the Padres have the best roster compared to the Dodgers because on paper it looks like we do because all the Dodgers players are injured. Right? You're just telling the judge and the opponents what is happening. to set up why disruption of that thing is probably going to be a very, very bad idea. The one thing that I cannot stress enough when it comes to uniqueness debates is timing of the evidence publication matters a ton, because you don't want to be arguing about a status of the status quo from 50 years ago, 30 years ago. Is that really the status quo? No, it's from the past. So when we're talking about uniqueness, you want to find something that's pretty recent and in open. A lot of your debates are on the dissad level or can come down to the uniqueness question. So the more up to date you are on uniqueness, the better your shot at just winning the dissad flow on that area, right? Both the affirmative and the negative have access to uniqueness arguments, one going one way, one going the other way, and based on recency can change the status as to like who is correct on the uniqueness debate, right? The links, this is where most of my research when it comes to the initial topic is release comes out, because I'm always trying to find like what is it that the plan on the topic can disrupt, right? So because the United States federal government is a giant institutional entity that has reverberating effects not only on a national level, but also on the global level, it can create a lot of changes in the current events of the world. So we're always trying to figure out what is it about passing a plan through the United States federal government going to do to the world, right? And the link tries to create that connection between the plan and the status quo and the disruption of it. In this example, we use like, if the dissad is about the economy, and you do have an economy dissad, it talks about how the economy is being strong now, i.e. your uniqueness evidence, and why the plan would sort of disrupt the economy. And then we would go into the later parts as to why that would be problematic, right? The other example is like fracking, right? Fracking employs what, I think 1 million people. And so if he were to abolish fracking, how many people would be unemployed? Would that have a diverse effect on the economy and such? Probably, right? But that is a link. Ending fracking would decimate the economy. Right now, fracking is a thing, and the economy is strong, right? The internal link is something that I find sort of confusing sometimes because it's like an impact, but it's not really an impact, i.e. it doesn't delve into an impact that is bigger or the same magnitude as the affirmative, but it has the potential to do so, right? So if we were to destroy the economy, will that have an effect on the world economy? Yeah, the 2008 housing crisis when the bubble popped ended up devastating the world economy, and there are still some countries that have not recovered from it till now. So when we're looking at that, it's like, okay, the economy tanking on a global level is bad, but does that outweigh extinction on the affirmative case, either through advantage 2, 3, and 4? The answer is no. But is there something worse that can come about when the economy is bad? There is. And that's where the impact is. And that's where the terminal impact that we like to talk about in debate comes from. So that's usually like what happens if the internal link comes true. And that usually means it'll resolve into either one of two impacts, a structural impact or a big stick. But these are not mutually exclusive because there's arguments about why big sticks can create structural problems. So a structural impact is like what will occur in society that will make ongoing problems that prevent people from meeting their basic needs, i.e. as an individual, there are certain basic needs I require in either to fulfill a healthy and fulfilled life, right? There are certain portions of society that make it problematic for me to do so, i.e. there are forces of sexism and racism and classism in society that make it so that people of color don't have the same advantages because of structures within society. If the affirmative propagates that by disrupting something that can resolve it, then that's probably a bad thing. The other example is what we like to call big stick impacts. My sophomore debater from last year referred to these as pew-pew impacts because they generally revolve guns and those of nature. In terms of magnitude, they usually go on a global level, right? People like to use big stick impacts because of the utilitarian calculus involved in how we traditionally evaluate debates. And a global impact generally is seen as like, war. And if we involve war with nuclear powers, that has the potential of global nuclear war. The other side of a big stick impact is also seen as environmental impacts, i.e., the one we talk about in the infrastructure dissad is warming. And why is warming bad? Well, we're feeling the effects of it now on both a national level as well as a global level, as to what warming is doing to these countries. And a lot of like scientific data is indicating that if we were to continue this trajectory, we're going to go into a catastrophic climate change that cannot be reversed and will eventually end with the destruction of the world. Right. So again, what is a disad? A disad is just telling the judge, here's the status quo. It is the beach. It's doing great. There's nothing bad that's happening, but your fracking site is going to cause a tsunami because it'll create an earthquake, as has been scientifically proven and observed, and it will decimate the coast and displace thousands and thousands of people. Right? Before, the beach was great, but fracking happened, and now the beach is not great. Right? So you're the 2AC. You just got hit with a dissent about infrastructure or the economy. What do you do? Well, we have a very structured way of dealing with it now that we call TULIP. It is called turns, uniqueness arguments, link defense, impact defense, and then prefer the affirmative, which is impact calculus coming from the affirmative versus the negative dissad. So do you all know what turns are? I hope you all know what turns are. We're in open now. So generally speaking, we have access to a link turn or an impact turn. Please never go for both. Don't say that your affirmative solves the problems of this disadvantage and that the problems of the disadvantage are good. Because that means that you are bad then, and you probably lose the debate if you do both. So pick one, either link turn or impact turn. I'm going to always suggest you link turn because if you impact turn structural problems, you're going to lose around. If you say the word racism good in front of most of your judges at Lambdol, you're just randomly going to lose the round because no one thinks that racism is a good idea, or sexism, or classism, those sorts of things. The uniqueness argument, if the negative is saying that the economy is doing great now, they might be wrong. They're probably wrong too. And it's always up for debate. Because the economy is a very fluctuating sort of circumstances in the US, and there's a lot of ways to measure it. You can always say, no, the economy is not doing great. It's actually doing bad right now. I.e., you're saying, no, that's your uniqueness argument is no, that's non-unique. The economy is bad now, right? Regardless of what the affirmative does, it will not make the economy worse because the economy is bad now, and it should have already done stuff to the impacts of the round, right? You can have more than one uniqueness argument. You should probably want to have 2 or 3. These are usually from cards, though they don't need to be if it's very common sense, but you should still have them and make sure, as I told you all earlier, that they are up to date and as close to the round as possible, i.e. I've had to cut uniqueness arguments the day of that they're released to have them be run 2 hours later in the day, right? And we may or may not win, but we want to have as much advantage as possible, right? Link defense is just saying that, we don't actually disrupt the status quo. I don't know what you're talking about. Fracking does not cause earthquakes. Our experts indicate that fracking is actually good good, and will not cause those earthquakes. So we can say no link. Right? No link. You can say no link multiple times, especially if the dissent has multiple links coming to the affirmative. The next one we want to say is impact defense. We want to be really careful here because if you say the problems of nuclear war are not as devastating as stated, i.e. nuclear war does not lead to extinction or nuclear war scenarios are unlikely, if your affirmative also has nuclear war, that bites you too. Right. So you need to be careful how you do impact defense. You can say the economy being destroyed does not lead to nuclear war, right? You're putting defense there as well. Whereas water wars from resources, say from advantage 4 of your affirmative, would. So just make sure if your impact of war is on the affirmative, make sure you don't say defensive arguments on the terminal impact, but instead have scenarios about the disadvantages as to why it will not lead to nuclear war or will lessen the likelihood of nuclear war, i.e. internal link defense, right? And then the last one is prefer the affirmative, i.e. the AF outweighs. So how do you say the AF outweighs? Well, there are certain structuring ways to do so. We like to say prefer my case over the negative disadvantage or the negative scenario because, right, is usually how the affirmative gets to leverage their impacts versus the negative disad. And the way to do so are three things: the time frame, the magnitude, and the probability. I.e., time frame deals with how quickly one impact is over the other. If we're dealing with global nuclear war versus warming, guess which one was probably going to happen quicker if it were to trigger? Most people think that global nuclear war would happen much quicker than global warming. So if the debate comes down to how fast do we die and how long do I want to live, well, I want to live as long as possible. Generally speaking, I will vote on the debater that extends global nuclear war versus environmental catastrophe. Magnitude just deals with how many people are affected by it, either on a structural level or a body count level, and not even people, but also just like the globe and the things around the globe. A probability is the likelihood of these scenarios coming true. Depending on the defensive arguments that you made versus the disad will change whether or not it is probable or not probable in the round, right? When you are negative, the way you would say impact calculus is usually with the disad outweighs and turns the case. To start your impact calculus to beat the affirmative, because it'll be at the top part of your speech on that flow, and it'll be comprehensive as to why the impacts of the negative disadvantage outweigh the AF, and why then the AF should not be voted upon, right? I stress so much that debaters should do impact calculus in policy debate because being able to see a clear picture of what the affirmative exactly does versus the negative and vice versa can paint me, who probably wins this round, i.e. if the impacts of the affirmative are much more probable and happen faster than the negative, there's always going to be a world I'm just going to vote affirmative in that case, especially if I don't know what the world of the disad looks like compared to the affirmative from the negative's point of view, right? So your neg, you read a disad, you just answered, or you got answered by the 2AC, and now you have to beat the 2AC answers. How do you do so? Well, first, don't just start off with they said this, right? The first thing you should always do when you go to an off-case position that you're extending and going for is to extend the shell that you're going to use, right? And on this side, there's a specific way we like to do it, and that's by first extending your initial shell and then doing quick impact calculus, and then finally doing the line by line. Usually it starts with extend our uniqueness evidence from 2021. It states that the economy is doing great now, but it can be very volatile if we are not careful. Secondly, extend our link evidence. Our YZX states that if the plan were to occur, it would disrupt the economy by doing this, right? And then that's bad because it'll lead to the economy being tanked. And if the economy gets tanked, it'll lead to global nuclear war, as what our impact evidence says. This turns and outweighs the case because, and then you would do your impact calculus as to why the disadvantage outweighs the case. Now, how does a disadvantage turn the case, right? If the advantage of the AF deals with structural violence, and your infrastructure disad's impact is warming, the higher the temperatures go and the less likelihood we can solve for warming, the more people are going to be affected by it. And your advantage one talks about how poorer people have less means possible to challenge problems in the world. And so the impacts of global warming are also going to impact them at a greater level, i.e., you cannot solve your advantage of structural violence in the 1EC if you're going to create more structural violence from warming from the disad, i.e., your affirmative cannot solve it, and actually it will get worse if we were to do the affirmative plan. That's what the turns case argument is always on the dissent, right? And if you have a nuclear war, you can definitely do so. A nuclear war affects, a lot of people and will cause a ton of structural violence because people will not have the means to be able to survive in a society, and it'll look like a world of like barbarism all over again, right? Uh, and then you can probably go to the line by line, right? They said this, but, right? And then you repeat it. If they use tulip, you can use this structuring. They say term, but their evidence is wrong. Believe our evidence because they say non-unique, but prefer our evidence because it's more new and the scientific research behind it is more nuanced than theirs, which is from a blog, right? You want to go down the line by line from the 2AC structure as to what they said it. If they started with uniqueness, that's great. You've already put uniqueness on the top of your 1NC flow. You can go, they say non-unique, but prefer our evidence. They say no link, but we definitely link. Here's what our link evidence says. And even if they win the no link, there's still a good chance the link arguments happen. So you should still prefer the negative, right? So you're going to have two disads in the camp tournament, and they'll be available for you all throughout the year as well. Just an FYI, infrastructure is one that probably will go away, hopefully by September or October, so we may not get access to this. But I think for the camp tournament, the infrastructure decide is vastly better than the economy debate. Right. So in order to run a disad, we also probably want to understand the components of the disad. If we're talking about the infrastructure disad, we probably want to know what infrastructure is and sort of like how infrastructure is determined in the United States in terms of policymaking, as well as just how much of the US does it affect, right? So, Market Business News indicates that infrastructure is the basic systems and services that a country or organization needs in order to function properly, i.e., the basic roadmap of what a country requires. These include roads and railways, utilities, which include like our water, our sewage, our electricity, our telephone lines, our cell towers, right? They also include air control, bridges, and other things like law enforcement agency, emergency services, i.e. firefighters as well, education, and blah, 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 blah. The list goes on. Basically, if it's required for society to function, it's probably going to be a part of the infrastructure of the US, right? The problem right now is our infrastructure is getting out of date and falling behind when it comes to a competitive edge around the world. I think from my reading, our roads have been needing repair and replacement since the 1970s. Right? Our roads were not meant to last this long without it being updated. But could we have just revamped all of it and rebuilt our road system? No, because it is very, very expensive to do. And finding a Congress that has enough of a majority or enough of a bipartisan edge to pass these really, really expensive bills is sort of hard to do. But is it required? Yes, because it increases the efficiency in how our services and our system function. And right now, we're sort of like failing that. And there is this looming problem associated with the world that we want to resolve soon because it is destroying our productivity in the nation. I.e., it's hard to go to work if you see the forest burning from global warming next to you, right? It's hard to go to work when your traffic systems are so bogged down that it takes an hour and a half to get to work, right? And that's just the example. Uh, So how do we fix it? Well, we need to pass a plan. We need to pass a bill, and there's already a bill being talked about that I think is about 3 trillion, but there's a separate 1 trillion bill on infrastructure that they're talking about. There's an initial estimate from Rachel Lane of a news organization that they did a bunch of research on, that the figure to update the infrastructure is probably going to cost around $2 trillion, right? We never heard of the word trillions until like the past few years in terms of spending that wasn't right from the budget spending. This is a bill to revamp and modernize our infrastructure, and it's going to cost $2 trillion. That's a lot of money. And when you're playing with a lot of money, the people who are in charge, i.e., Congress and the presidency, will want to have a lot of say in it. Right. And so this is going to be contentious, and there'll be Republicans and Democrats going one way or another, depending on uh, how they believe it should go. Right. And so why not just pass it? Well, our Congress is very partisan right now, and politics is a game that is played at the highest stakes, because whoever probably passes this will gain a good chunk of leverage when it comes to voters, right? Because it'll have an effect not only on jobs, but the money going into the economy from those jobs, the increased productivity and efficiency of our services and utilities, increasing our GDP, and generally increasing our quality of life. If the Democrats get credit for this, is there a better likelihood that they'll win elections? Yes, because they can put this out and put it into the media and say, look at what we did for you. You should vote for us, which the GOP probably does not want to happen because they want to control the levers of power too, because there's a lot of money to be made uh, in politics, right? And so it's always going to be one of those things that have a power play from both sides, i.e., meaning there's a lot of evidence coming out from both sides that will help both the affirmative and negative if they know where to look for it. Right. So, what is then the infrastructure decide in debate? We call this a politics decide because it deals with the people who are in power changing how policy should be done, right? Just like how the affirmative is going to pass a plan, a politics decide deals with the consequences of that plan passing on a political level, right? And because it requires federal passing of that plan, i.e., Congress, that needs the signature of the president, if you were to do a plan from fracking for the affirmative, it will have political consequences on the people who are trying to reach over the aisle to the Republicans, because there's a pretty good chance Democrats will want to pass your plan and not. Yes, yes. So this is why I love uniqueness arguments, right? I think it was yesterday they came up with a new agreement between the Republicans and Democrats that they agreed on the $1 trillion update to one of the infrastructure plans, right? There are two infrastructure bills being debated about now. The one that they've sort of agreed on but haven't voted hard on. No, I think they voted. It was a 14 Republicans or something like that, with all the Democrats. And then Trump getting really, really mad, being like, no, we're going to challenge you in the primaries. But that was on the 1 trillion bill. This didn't touch the $3 trillion bill that Biden wants to pass as well. This is their compromise to the Republicans that we're going to do this, and then hopefully it will create bipartisan cooperation so that the other bigger bill will pass. Are we allowed to cut this? I don't actually know, because I don't know what Devin and Joel's agreement is about updated evidence, but I'm probably going to assume no. You will be limited to the camp. So you are going to pretend that thing from yesterday never happened. We live in a weird time bubble where we're only talking about the time of your evidence back then, right? But this doesn't nix away the big plan. It just changes how the uniqueness evidence uh, will will shift it, right? if something happens like the affirmative on fracking, will that make the $3 trillion bill that's next to this $1 trillion bill bad? It could, right? So knowing the distinction that there's two infrastructure bills being debated about is important, and not just one, right? This is the smaller of the bigger one. The bigger one is what Biden really wants to pass. The $1 trillion bill is a form of, going within the Republican and the Democrats on a bipartisan thing. The bill, which is on the pack, doesn't clearly state, but you'll have to look at your link evidence to do that. I would assume it's the bigger one, but again, look at your evidence for that. So, and I'll also get into it because I do have a shell on the slide in a little bit. So what does it have to do with the topic and infrastructure? Well, if you all remember, Trump passed a bunch of laws to make it so that private businesses have a lot more access to just using water in a not most friendly way, i.e. in fracking. He deregulated it so that it wouldn't have to meet certain regulations that the EPA had, and made it one of those like, yeah, we can definitely do it, but just not fracking. And so the Republicans probably don't want that to go away, because a good amount of political like shifts will occur from it, from like, oh, you just change how one of our leaders' policies were. That's a bad thing. Why would you do that? And they will get mad, right? And so it deals with a cause and effect of changing policies associated with water protection that the past has dictated it should be this way, and then the amendment to the EPA will definitely change that, i.e. the amendment will allow it so that fracking is part of the regulations, as well as private citizens can sue the industries for the things that they've done to the environment and themselves, right? So this is your uniqueness evidence from the shell. It is not highlighted, but I did cut the evidence where I think that I think it can end. I would not highlight this entire thing because it's not necessary. But this deals with like the bipartisan deal that is occurring right now. This is the $3 trillion bill on the uniqueness question, because $1 trillion of it is just on like, climate related stuff. So it's the bigger bill out of the two. So the Morasco evidence is about that. And you can be like, look, they're reaching across the aisle. The bill that was passed yesterday proves that you can reach across the aisle. But was fracking a part of that reaching across the aisle? No, fracking was not a part of it. The plan hadn't passed yet. So right now things are great, right? They're willing to engage in bipartisan talks, right? And there's even like a Republican senator named Bill Cassidy, who's a leader, like has brought up issues that he would want in the bill for his constituents that will be helpful. So there's ongoing talks between both sides of the aisle on the bill that will be great, right? And because they've already passed the $1 trillion thing, I think those talks have been pretty successful. The link evidence says, but you need to be really, really careful, right? Because Water of the United States plans, i.e. the affirmative that deals with fracking, that has effects on water, would destroy any bipartisan cooperation that the Democrats and the Republicans have. And that's your link evidence, right? And that's from Friedman in 2021, but from June 9th. You notice how the date of both this uniqueness evidence, 6/12, and the link evidence from Friedman is sort of like recent, because we need to be talking about the status quo, and infrastructure is one that is ever changing. And if Friedman is correct about how much Republicans dislike water bills or water protections or changing water statuses in the United States, if you have a more up-to-date that tells the judge, no, actually, Republicans love water changes, then you can probably win the link debate too, because it is more up to date on how the plan would affect water, right? So there's arguments for recency on the link evidence if the conditions have changed in the status quo to do so, right? And then did I miss it? Okay. Wait, did I miss the internal link? I think I missed the internal link. Yeah. So the internal link to this was if we noticed on the uniqueness question, uh, 1 trillion of this will be related to climate related investments. That's important because in 2014, 2015, the Paris sort of stuff was being negotiated and then passed. And when Biden came back into office, we signed up to be a part of that Paris, and we needed to maintain commitments to Paris to fight global climate change. And we need to do so now because if we don't, we will all die from warming, i.e., the terminal impact evidence from Karevi 18 that talks about how climate change will destroy the world. This evidence is not as up to date, but the warrants behind it have not really changed since 2018 to 2021. It's been corroborated by other experts that climate change is real and probably getting worse, but it doesn't change the status of like, is warming still going to lead to extinction? These experts have generally said yes. So you only really need one evidence, right? So infrastructure, again, the uniqueness is that the bill would revamp and modernize our infrastructure, and we're sort of like good on a bipartisan manner, but just barely. And it's contentious. Like Trump is throwing fireworks at it all over the place to make sure that it doesn't get passed because Trump attempted infrastructure during his term and it failed, right? The link is that the plan would change this and reversing Trump policies associated with water because Trump clarified this during his reign. Would anger the Republicans and make them not want to negotiate with other bills that Democrats want to do, especially on an industry, right? Fracking employs 1 million people. That's going to have major effects on voters. And they're going to try to leverage that anger as to why you don't want to pass an infrastructure bill, right? The internal link evidence says that's really, really dangerous because this infrastructure bill is necessary for us to make the commitment necessary for the Paris Agreement, as well as take a leadership role in it to fight climate change, right? And that's really important because warming that we can't fix will cause extinction. Now, is there a problem with this ad? Yeah, there is. It doesn't say that this is the key policy to fix climate change. This doesn't say that the DISAD internal link will solve climate change, right? So that's probably one of those two AC answers that you want to do in terms of the DISAD to like beat it. It's like, yeah, you say warming will cause extinction, but like just having climate change, infrastructure does not mean warming will end, right? At best, you might mitigate it. We could still have runaway warming, etc. That may be a impact is inevitable sort of argument from the 2AC, though I'd be really, really careful from that because you set up a debate where we're all going to die. It just how fast do we want to die, right? The other dissent that you have, and I think this one is going to be used more this year, though I'm not the biggest fan of economy debates anymore, is the fact that the affirmative plan would wreck the economy and do some stuff. So what is the economy? When we were talking about the economy, we're talking about the potential of all 50 states, right, and all of its territories, and how each one of their businesses and services are doing. This is how we measure whether or not the economy is healthy. So that requires what? Well, that requires a booming GDP. The gross domestic product of the nation is doing well. So what is the GDP? It's the measuring stick as to whether or not the economy is doing good or doing bad. Alarms go up the moment the GDP goes negative. Alarms go up, we panic, and we're like, what are we doing wrong? And business investors will go crazy. Stock market will fall drastically if we ever get into a negative GDP. But sometimes there's no choice. Sometimes world emergencies happen, like, I don't know, the global pandemic of the early 1900s that had major, major effects on the GDP of not just the US as well as the world. But we were in World War I at that time, so we were also doing a lot of things with the GDP that whatever. So how do we measure it? Well, we measure it by seeing how much consumers are spending, i.e., if I'm spending less uh, in businesses or at the grocery store or on Amazon, etc., that probably means the GDP for me is probably less. Now add that to 200 and something million in terms of spending power, and we can measure not whether the GDP is healthy from the consumer side. The other one is whether or not businesses like manufacturing, construction, and even the internet companies and internet infrastructure is doing well, right? We need to see whether or not we're making products and creating something out of nothing. And how well we're doing so. Are we able to actually do so? Or are we having a tough time finding employees to do so? Or are there just no demand for those products, right? The next metric is government spending. This is sort of like one of those things that'll probably stay the same and slightly go up every year, unless we add something like Space Force, and we need to invest billions and billions of dollars into Space Force because we want to create a new agency about sending people into space for space warfare and protection, whatever. And finally, our trade. This deals with the imports and exports, but generally speaking, just the exports of the US to other countries, because that's seen as a net positive compared to imports where we're actually losing money. So if we're exporting more products, it means that more people want to buy our products from overseas. That means the people in the US are making a profit off of those transactions. That's how we measure the GDP, and these are all the components of it. Generally speaking, we want the GDP to rise about 1% to 2% a year in America and keep it stable at that. If we are doing so, we are seen as a healthy economy, okay? Uh, the reason why we love the economy debate in policy is because it's always fluctuating. The circumstances around the economy are never the same from month on end. And depending on what Congress wants to do and what Congress is thinking about doing, it can have effects there, right? And the next thing is because the US economy is so big, it has major international effects. So it's easier to talk about global effects of the economy going down from a debate perspective from there, right? So the economy in water deals with what happens when we get rid of water protection policies that were not get rid of water protection policies. If we change water protection policies that Trump enacted and how it'll affect the economy, right? The negative argues that these water policies will restrict businesses that just recently gained more access to the waters of the United States that Trump clarified, i.e., before Trump, 99% of all water in the US was federally owned or was under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So it created a lot of uncertainty within private businesses as to how they should conduct their businesses. They didn't know how many things that they should order because they didn't know if they would have access to the water necessary to create their products for the market, right? Having uncertainty for a good chunk of businesses is bad because it stunts growth and it hurts the ability of that business to flourish, right? Biden in Congress, if we were to do the fracking, would change how the federal government views water by giving the federal government, again, more access to the water that Trump just gave a lot to the private entities, right? And so that can lead into effects of those businesses now in the status quo, especially with COVID around and especially with a volatile world economy, that could be devastating, right? So when we deal with water and the economy in your disad, we're dealing specifically with agriculture. And that talks about how agricultural businesses in the US and the economy are great now because when Trump passed his bill, it made it so businesses as well as other areas of the economy were happy with it. But if we were to change it, we need to be really, really careful because it will collapse confidence and growth. And that's your Wheeler 2020 evidence. The first thing here that you should look at is this evidence is a year old, right? So we need to be really careful with this uniqueness evidence. The second argument that you're going to be making if you're going to be running water is that water of the United States changes would create mass delays and confusions that would tank every sector of the economy. And since the uniqueness evidence focused on farming, you also want to focus on farming. This was about the waters of the United States. If they were to change it back, right, to where the federal government had major control, i.e. the plan on fracking, this would create delays in permits, right, litigation because of lawsuits that will come from it as private companies try to get more access to water, and even closures as businesses don't know how much water that they can have access to and will not be able to have a good way to conduct businesses. And that's really scary. Why? Because the small businesses and farms are key to the economy, right? They employ 14% of all people that can work, and this economy or this sector reaches every other facet of the economy, i.e. it spills over into other areas. This is the Harvey and Steffi 2010 evidence. And that's what it indicates. That's basically what it indicates. And why is that important? Because economic decline causes war. This is from Sundaram. This talks about how when the economies of the world are in a bad state, depending on the rhetoric centered around the global economy or the global macro politics of the world, i.e. you have people like Trump reverberating drums of war when the economy is bad. If you have multiple people like that, there's actually a chance war will occur. And if enough countries that have nuclear weapons get into war, there is a really good chance nuclear weapons will also be involved, right? So again, the economic disadvantage is Trump passes a law that clarified who owned what in terms of water. That needs to be very, very, very careful with the plan. But the plan would change that because it would create federal government overreach and change regulations around water again. And that'll confuse and make businesses that deal in water like farmers lose confidence and lose access to their businesses. This is problematic because small farmers make up a good percentage of the economy. And if they collapse, so will the economy. And if that collapses, we'll get into global nuclear war. Now, why is the economy debate something that is probably not the most fun to be running? Well, we've dealt with the 2008 recession, right? That caused a global nuclear war? No. We had a bunch of authoritarian regimes globally at that time too. Did they create a global nuclear war from creating wars of adventure that the other major nuclear powers got involved in that created a nuclear war? No. Has the economy tanked to the point where the disadvantaged probably thinks it will need to tank? Probably in the past, like pandemic year, right? The world economy is not in a healthy state. So why has war not occurred already? Right? There's a lot of really good defensive arguments coming from the affirmative to deal with the war impact associated with economic decline that you need to pull leverage from, right? There's multiple examples of the US and the global economy tanking and not causing nuclear war, right? And the fact that the uniqueness evidence is sort of old is also a reason why this ad is probably not the best. And there's already protections if the economy were to go down. Like say, I don't know, from the Trump trade deal, where the United States federal government can just give them cash, right? So even if, even if the farmers are affected by this, there is a really good chance Biden will just pay off those farmers so that they can continue to produce, right? Just like what Trump did when he was creating his trade war policies. If you are negative, or if you're affirmative, that's probably one of the analytical answers I would definitely make. If I were to run decide which one would I run, I would run the first one. I'd run infrastructure, right? Because I think it doesn't link to the states, where this probably will, in terms of like control of the government on water areas. Like if the states were to do it, this probably also links into it, where infrastructure does not. And I think the infrastructure disad is just better structured than the econ disad in terms of like the strength of their evidence and just the argument centered around it. Do you have any questions, concerns, comments?